Before starting, since we discussed this a lot in the previous panel, I would like to congratulate the professors and faculty of Brazil who are celebrating their day. I don't want to disturb the interpreters, but let me say in Portuguese that I congratulate you all on your day for the work you do. As you can tell by the number of people that we have here for this panel, is that we have several pain points and we have a very little time. But anyway, we will try to share some tips in this panel to see how we can address these critical pain points. I was also listening to the previous panel and I was thinking at the same time. As a traditional planner, I have taken note of different things. And as a situational planner, I made some adjustments to my notes based on what was said here. Many issues have already been raised here, so I don't want to repeat myself since I'm quite positive and I'm a situational planner. I was thinking that it's so good that we have some level of agreement. So we will try to look for some concrete actions. But let me begin by introducing my colleague Cecilia Veleda in the first place. I know her very well, so I had to keep a note of her bio. We have a diverse panel here. We have economists, we have representatives of philosophy and literature, psychology, education, and myself, a political scientist. So Cecilia Veleda is a psychologist. She has a master's degree in education. She had her PhD degree in sociology from France. She was also part of a management team, so she has experience in management. That is another important characteristic in this panel because it is one thing to talk about theoretical content, but then to deal with the practical management. And she was also a CTEP um, collaborator. We have a lot of experience, despite the fact that we are all young. We also have with us from the state of Nuevo León, Sofia Leticia. I have just discovered that we attended the same university for a master's degree. She has a degree in philosophy and literature. She also studied in the Harvard Education School. That is why Jose Weinstein is here. And she was also in a management position. She's not just the Secretary of Education of the state of Nuevo León now. She participated in the Secretary of Public Education in Mexico for many years that groups together all the states that make up the United States of Mexico. We also have with us Javier Gonzalez, who is a Cambridge economist, and he focuses on policy, social policies, and he is the founder and director of SUMA. He will tell us more about this organization. And Alejandro Vera, whom I've known him for some time, is an economist as well. He took important positions in different areas. I think that he worked with someone who was here in the morning at the National Ministry of Education in Argentina. And now he is part of the UNESCO Santiago office in charge of the Education Monitoring and Planning Unit. I'm myself, Mariana Clusellas, who I am a political scientist and have a passion for education. So the purpose of this panel is the following. Um, I have some notes to see what we could find in Menti. Why have we put together this panel? Let me quickly go through this. I think this was systematized and it is quite interesting. Daniela Trucco showed some figures that portray the high levels of inequality that exist in Latin America and the Caribbean. Our director also said that these are not indicators that actually reflect what this means for our societies, which puts us in an even more difficult situation to find resources, although it is not impossible. That level of inequality is also seen in access opportunities to education, considering gender, socioeconomic class, o- ethnic origin, the migratory processes to see if we have nationals of a country or not, and all these contributes to making even more difficult to plan inclusive and egalitarian policies. These are goals that in our organizations we pursue. So we are going to have a look at the Menti app again, and it is interesting to see that we have new words coming up there. In the first activity, we saw many words that were actually verbs like mm, preparing, organizing, anticipating. But here we have the deliberate action of certain actions to achieve certain results. That is what planning means for us in education. Now, when we ask you about the big challenges for educational planning in the region, we see less linear replies. We see uncertainty, equity, funding, adaptation, resources, consensus, inequality, the other side of the coin with regard to equity. And I expected some of these words to pop up here, but I just wanted to share with you a few perspectives from my position as a political scientist. Going back to what the Secretary of Education said this morning, why do we plan? And why, if when we engage in planning, we still don't achieve long-term sustainable policies? Or why are we still dissatisfied with our achievements in the field of education? So we have public policy and education as two very complex fields to work on. So why? Daniela said this several times. Jose Weinstein also mentioned this. The outcomes of those policies can only be analyzed considering long periods of time. So they are not easily detectable. So this is not profitable sometimes for politicians. There is some tension in terms of time here to achieve actual changes. And ministers, among other stakeholders, as our director said, have to be able to demonstrate results in order to continue being able to work for a fairer education system. So I was given this explanation that we talk about expenses or expenditure when we talk about education because of some accounting needs when we look at the profit and loss statements. But usually, when it comes to education, investment is left to the last place. And then when we have a reform, we don't know if the effects that we are evaluating have to do with the first policy that we implemented for 9 months or the results of the second policy that was there in place for 24 months. So sometimes we don't know how to attribute those losses or uh, benefits. We have several stakeholders involved. Sometimes they do not necessarily share the same interests and they do not necessarily agree on the what. I think that all of us agree on the what, but sometimes complications emerge when we start looking at the how, because That gives us clarity on who are the stakeholders that will have to pay for the cost of those changes and who will benefit from those changes. And this is not exclusive to this region. It happens to all countries, but in other countries you have more resources, so perhaps this is not so clearly seen. But what we see is that stakeholders that pay for the cost of those changes have more concentration and negotiation power than those that benefit from these changes that are more disaggregated, such as families, students, etc. In addition to that, at the national level, we have several stakeholders at different levels of government. So I'm going to give the floor now to Cecilia Veleda. I know that you have just come from a trip. Thank you for being here. She has been leading the IEP study on state capabilities. But I think Jose also mentioned this idea of intermediaries. This is important not just for those people who work at school, those stakeholders that are at the school level, but also those other stakeholders that need to interpret those policies and make sense out of them. Because not all schools, not all districts, not all regions in countries with high levels of inequality have the same organizational, cognitive, or resource capabilities in order to drive those actions forward. But they are well aware of the context, and oftentimes we don't have the knowledge because perhaps that is not objectively expressed in the classical way. So, from a governance standpoint, Cecilia, which are the critical pain points in order to have sustainable, effective, and equity based policies? Thank you, Mariana. Good afternoon to you all. I wanted to share with you some preliminary findings because we are still in the process of systematizing the results of a research study that we conducted. We started answering the question on the how. We know that the distance between the declared and actual right to education is increasingly bigger. We look at learning outcomes based on a dramatic indicator, that is that 1 out of 2 third grade students in many of our countries is not fully literate. And we know that our governments play an essential role in changing the situation and dealing with this huge challenge that Mariana has described here. We know that education policies are the most difficult ones among all public policies because of the number of parties involved, because of the size of the field, because of the mission that education has, trying to effect deep transformations in people and in students, and because we have so many students and faculty throughout the system. So in this study, we try to analyze what the ideal capabilities would be. What would be the government capabilities that would be required to achieve a systemic, sustained reform of the education system? On the other hand, we also try to examine 7 capabilities that we identified. We could have some more, but we agreed on 7 capabilities. So, to what extent they exist in the ministries of education in Latin American countries? We conducted a large survey, something that is unprecedented, looking at different dimensions of the how component. At the same time, we studied 6 subnational states that have succeeded in improving their indicators over the last 20 years. we sought to look in detail at this information with through 60 interviews to try to find out which of those capabilities had been developed, to what extent, what was the process they followed, what were the prior steps or the subsequent steps, and how they developed those 7 capabilities. So I would like to share some preliminary findings with you. We are in the process of mm, bringing together different levels of the information in the study. So I'm going to focus on the planning uh, capability or the planning capacity. So in that regard, I apologize. As Mariana said, I have just mm, come back from a trip, so I wasn't here this morning. There are different theoretical approaches, but we consider 4 conceptual approaches. First, that the one on leadership, what the leadership approach says about those 7 capacities. What about the incentives? What happens with the institutional dimension when we look at government capacity? And finally, the theories on systemic change and cultural change in the field of education. So, in summary, we find some common points in our approach. We believe it is essential to take as the starting point the theory of change to address these problems and the different strategies to overcome those problems. The theory of change has to start with a diagnosis founded on reliable statistical data and the participation of different stakeholders. The theory of change and the defined strategies have to be constantly monitored, and they have to be redirected based on the results produced along the way. So this is the ideal goal. 56% of the 824 officials of ministries of education from 18 countries in the region that were interviewed think that the ministry has a strategic medium term plan between 6 and 8 years, but more plan. They think that only 48% of faculty and principals have a medium or high level of knowledge about these plans, and that only 24% of the overall population are aware of these plans. So here we are talking about a plan that needs to involve different stakeholders, but these are the figures that we see on average. Then we may have some differences at an individual country level. With regard to the use of information, 57% of those surveyed say that the statistical information is used and information on educational evaluation, but only 30% of them consider that the opinion of stakeholders in the field of education or education institutions are taken into account. Once again, we see a significant breakdown here, a significant cutoff point or difference between what people at the ministry think and what people at schools think. At the same time, if we consider the case studies, in this case, we had case studies on Chile, Peru, Ecuador, Ceará, and Pernambuco. 6 different states that were subjected to an in-depth analysis. So in these cases, the diagnosis can be a driver for change. That was the case, for instance, of a few examples that I can mention here. For instance, in the case of Ecuador, the CERCE evaluation was the starting point for a significant social mobilization that led to the drafting of a plan that put together all the scaffolding for the transformation that came later. And in all these cases, the involvement of the major stakeholders in the education system in planning and implementation was essential to achieve a significant level of commitment to those changes. And this was experienced in different ways in the various countries. Chile, Costa Rica, Peru, and Ecuador created national education councils made up of different representatives of stakeholders in the system, and they established a close relationship as a consultative body with ministerial officials. Then in Ceará and Pernambuco in particular, we saw there is ongoing work at all levels of the system, especially at the municipal intermediate level and the school level. They hold systematic meetings, and sometimes in schools, they meet with the educational community once every 2 months in order to keep everyone updated and also to gather the opinions of different actors in the field of education policy. And it was difficult to prioritize some goals for communication with a breakdown at the intermediate and school level, and goals by municipality, goals by school, and the dimension of monitoring was different depending on the case. In some successful cases, they were able to keep a close monitoring and follow up on those changes to reorient their actions on an ongoing basis. In some cases, they applied incentive-based systems, and in other cases, it was not just incentives or support. In some cases, it was both incentives and support to the schools. Mariana is telling me that I should wrap up, so just let me finish by saying that the planning capacity was closely linked to the other capabilities that we identified. Later on, I can mention them all in the Q&A. And in particular, in those cases where they had a more or smoother transformation processes, were those where they achieve a closer linkage with all these capabilities and a planning process that was not just theoretical. It was a planning effort that had constant feedback from all stakeholders. Thank you.
Let me tell you something. Rather than for respecting the times, I'm not that obedient, but this is a strategic thing. It's a very interesting study, so I didn't want her to show all the information so that then you go and read it. Well, as I took a note of some of the things that you mentioned. I think we're going back to the assessment thing afterwards, perhaps with Alejandro. I don't want to put the spotlight on you, but you mentioned communication, prioritization. Those are many of the pain points. And now we are moving to the great pain point in the region, that is the material feasibility conditions for the implementation of educational policies. And for that, I'm going to invite Javier Gonzalez to share his view in 7 or 8 minutes. Thank you. Thank you, IIEP, for inviting me to this meeting around these topics that affect us all. So first I'm going to speak about the funding, which is one of the material conditions that limit us every day. We're not speaking of more or fewer dollars, but those dollars translate into malnutrition, in lower salaries, and those salaries then lead to our teachers having multiple jobs. So I think it's an important issue. So the invitation by Alejandra and the team was to talk about what factors should be considered for this. I would like to start, as has been said, but it's good, as you mentioned, to highlight this even more. First, the importance of having a common goal as to what we want to fund, which is obvious. But in a context in which the Latin American and global democracies are in a crisis, that common north is not that obvious and it's more difficult to achieve. So we all agree that education is important. So far, so good. But beyond that, differences appear. And therefore, in a context of policies that are more identity based, speaking of my own country, we can say that even something as general as a constitution took us 2 rounds of constitutional meetings that ended up in nothing. So there's a big difficulty for thinking together and agreeing on certain perspectives. And then what we want to fund and how we want to fund it. But that's a more macro level of the democracies in a crisis and the inability to have a dialogue. But in the education, we think of this in terms of privatization, for instance, which is key in the planning. That is the governance of our system and how we distribute resources. Latin America is not just the most unequal region in the world, as Daniela mentioned, but also the most privatized region in the world. Perhaps we are even with sub-Saharan Africa, but it's the more privatized, the most privatized region in the world. And that leads to we of course we have the opting out, that is a middle class and a high class that leave the public education system and they are not willing to pay for the taxes for the public educational system where we are all involved. So we have democracy on the one hand, privatization on the one hand that transforms education in an individual thing, so it's very difficult to understand it as a place for encounter. I think it has been mentioned already, the issue of the importance of governance, sectorial plans that not all countries have, and the issue of articulation between states, academia, civil society, teachers. I think that allows for public policies to become state policies, which is so difficult in Latin America. So that's about the common north that seems so easy, but it's not. Second, how to sustain that common goal. And here, well, 2 topics: economic development, the low growth rate, but something that we are not discussing here is taxes. I mean, the tax burden in Latin America is around 21%, in OECD countries, 31% of GDP. And you might say, well, it's quite obvious. We are not the OECD. But in my academic life, I've studied these topics. I've published a couple of studies about how OECD countries, when they had the same GDP per capita, this was a study with Chile from 2013, what tax burden they had. Was it a problem of the state of development or was it a political decision? In the case of Chile, well, you can replicate this and you reach almost the same conclusion for all of Latin America. Perhaps Brazil is different. And that basically countries with the same GDP per capita as Chile in 2013 had a tax burden that was 10% higher compared to GDP. There was an institutional delay or tax delay in this case. So as an economist, as she was saying, I don't know if it's positive or negative. It's quite negative, I think. What I mean is that basically this is not an issue of the economy. It's a political issue and something which is not talked enough in the fora. It's there are some lonely claims, but it has to be discussed in the fora or for educational policy. That's the second big topic. So how we sustain this with a higher tax or a clearer tax burden. The third big topic, of course, is the issue of the sufficiency. There's a lot of debate about this in the Agenda 2030. They mentioned 4, 6%. I think that's a goal that shows the effort that countries are making to invest in education, but it doesn't say anything about the real absolute conditions that education should have. The cost of education has an absolute correlation. There's a correlation that many studies put between 6,000 to 8,000 per student per year, and Latin America invests 2,200. In Argentina, for instance, in Argentina, now we are here, 54% of teachers in Argentina work in 2 or more schools. And it's a high percentage in more than 3 schools. This is for regulatory issues, but also for salary issues. The problem, and this leads us to the second issue, not just the sufficiency, but also the efficacy. If there's not enough funding for salaries, teachers, in some cases, some call them taxi teachers, and it's the reality that it exists in the system. So that spending does not translate into better education because about educational feedback, what planning can a teacher do if they're working in 3 schools? It's impossible. So the spending also translates in the efficacy of the spending, which is the fourth concept. That is the efficacy in the spending. The importance of increasingly connecting the funding with activities. We mentioned improvement plans that are related to the resources. It's not I'm going to do this and then on the other hand, this is the budget. How are these two things connected? It's key for educational planning to be real and to be done efficiently. That's the other big concept, the issue of efficiency. There are inefficiencies. Recently, I attended a forum in the Caribbean, and they said it's not important to increase spending. They spend 1,000 per student per year with high rates of malnutrition, as long as we don't improve efficiency. There's a big discourse in that sense. How efficient can we be with just $1,000 per year? So it runs both ways. We have to be efficient, effective. So decentralization in some cases can play a key role in some countries. We see, for instance, the repairs of minor infrastructure. Sometimes it's more efficient to do it locally. If it's major repairs, it's more efficient to do it centrally. There's no formula for that. And finally, the two concepts, of course, the issue of equality and on equity. A lot is said about equity, but in the area of funding, it's almost non-existent. When we see in most of our countries, distributions are made based on historical distributions or adjusted for tuition. So I would like here to try and visualize the differences. When I say differences, it's not just social differences, social class, cultural capital, etc., but also the situation of the different populations that make up our system. We're speaking of the youth deprived of their freedom. 30%, I repeat all the time, it's a scandal. 30% of the youth that are under the guardianship of the state in Latin America in prisons that are deprived of their right to freedom but not of their right to education do not receive education while they are in prison. It's another crime against a young person to whom society has failed. The agenda for the region is national security, but nobody says what to do in the schools, in jails. I don't know if our Mexican colleague can share an experience, but I'm sure there are in many experiences in most of our countries. Countries that are under the scourge of violence, but they don't pay attention to the importance of the school, the jail schools, or the LGBTI youth, that also implies different costs for that inclusion. And the inclusion has not only to recognize and value diversity, but also build on that. And that has a cost. So we have to recognize the higher cost of the ethnic minorities. I was in Cusco recently with some indigenous communities at 4,000 meters above sea level, and we discussed literacy. There was an issue of discrimination because of the bilingualism there, and there were no possibilities. So, I mean, the budgetary planning, that is not taken into account. It's like all students are in a regular school, but we have to start disaggregating the population and understanding their needs and recognizing that higher cost, at least gradually. And finally, the issue of transparency, which is key, not only in terms of the ability to supervise, but also the ability to participate in decisions. An interesting case is Costa Rica with the school boards that allow the school community as a whole to be involved in the investment decisions at a certain level with the problems it may bring. But in general, for instance, it's an interesting system. So those are some of the considerations I wanted to share, Mariana.
It was worth it. When indicate that you are an economist, isn't just for clarification. I think that we complement one another. I'm sure that these are obviously political decisions. This morning, Alejandro Morio Chowitz once said, if you want to know how much importance a government attaches to education, you have to look at how much budget it allocates to that. And now I think that this is a responsibility of the entire society, because that wouldn't be me, but when you put forward more progressive policies, not just the government, but also society shows some resistance. And what you mentioned, and what Daniela also mentioned, leads me to go back to what we said at the beginning. We have to speak about education from a rights perspective. That is something that we have always focused on in our Office for Latin America of the IEP. Now it's Alejandro Vera's turn. I would love to listen to you. Thank you, Mariana. I would like also to show my appreciation to all the IEP colleagues who have organized this event. We are so happy to be back in person again. We feel very comfortable here at the OEI and among all of you. So thank you for inviting me. All right. So data use and production is a critical pain point for educational planning. When we talk about planning, when you think about planning, you tend to think about data. As Cecilia was saying, diagnosis, monitoring, all those activities require data and information. So here we are wondering what planning means today. What is the future of educational planning? So this leads us to think what information we need and how we should work with that information. So let me just share a few remarks. I would dare to say that the underlying question, what we are planning for, is still there. Planning requires setting a north, deciding how you are going to pursue the objectives. In education, objectives are inclusion, equity, knowledge sharing with students, but how can we meet those objectives? But something that has changed significantly and has a deep impact on data is the content of the plan. what methods, what processes we use to produce information to support the plan. Earlier this morning, we said that education has always been dynamic and has been subject to changes, but quite lately, those changes have been more abrupt. There are a number of phenomena that are challenging us in the system. We have profound changes, recurring crisis. Mariana is going to talk about education in a crisis context, COVID-19, insecurity problems. So now we are dealing with a new dynamics. We have some new phenomena or intensified phenomena such as migration at the current scale that was unknown to us in this region. Um, we have the global citizenship, sustainable development, climate change that also requires some action in the field of education. We see paradigms changing. We now look at inclusion differently from what we used to think 10 years ago. And for all these, we need data. Although significant progress has been made to produce data, we have more data than ever before, we still have a lot of challenges to include all these new topics. There is a big imbalance in some classical dimensions like the learning itineraries or the learning pathways. We have had an abundance of data, but in other cases, we have no indicators at all. The UNESCO Santiago office, as our director said earlier this morning, has two regional information systems, one on migrant students and another one on um, students with disabilities. The problem is not how we produce the data, but how we are going to measure that, how we define a migrant student or a mobile student. There are some conceptual issues to gather data in these areas. So data production faces these challenges, and we have this kind of imbalance. We have made a lot of progress in some areas, but we still have a long way to go in others. So those of us working with data and with planning need to find a balance in the information. We have also changed the way in which we work with data, and this is due to the emergence of new technologies, due to technological advances. In the last 10 to 20 years, the way we gather information, the way we process information, and we disseminate that information has changed significantly as a result of technology. And now we have expanded our borders and we can do much more than we expected earlier. Some years ago, UNESCO organized an international seminar on information system, the second one in that area. And UNESCO identified two trends at that time that were going to change the way that we work the way in which we work with data in education. One was the ability to process large volumes of information, partly in real time. And the second one was the possibility of doing learning management through data. Today, I would add a third one, AI. At that time, we didn't have Chat GPT, but now I would add that trend. And these trends that were identified 3 years ago account for things that are happening in the region. I see several colleagues here working with information systems and data, but if I were to ask you what are the two clearest trends seen in the region, probably you would mention the early warning systems, and they are the stars as a result of COVID-19, and then assisted technology assisted teaching. And these two big trends that we see increasingly present are the result of these disruptions that were identified 3 years ago in the seminar. But technology brings in another dimension to planning and management. And that means that it has also democratized the use of the tools, which are no longer the assets of national ministries. This happens also at the subnational level and also at schools. And that lever that we were looking for to connect the macro level with the micro level. I'm not saying that this is the solution, but it is a vehicle that allows us to work at all levels. But in turn, I think that this brings to the table another challenge that we didn't have before. We need to develop the capacity so that all the stakeholders can work with this technology. In Chile, sometimes we say that we have highly sophisticated tools, but not all the stakeholders are able to work with those tools and to understand the information produced with those tools. So now we see this new need emerging to train new stakeholders. It used to be just the officials, government officials, but now we have also school uh, stakeholders that use this information. Cecilia talked about 57% of government officials who claim that they have used information. What happens with the remaining 43%? We want them to use AI now. So there comes another imbalance, an imbalance between capacities and possibilities. So wrapping up, let me make emphasis on these two imbalances that we see. There is an imbalance between traditional statistics and emerging statistics. We need to pay attention to that imbalance. Many of those emerging statistics do not even require a computer, just require to sit at the same table and reach some level of agreement. And the second imbalance is the one that I mentioned a couple of minutes ago. What technology allows us to do and what our stakeholders in the different levels of the education system are capable of doing with that information. I would stop now. Thank you, Alejandro. So we are going to delve deeper into this uh, topic of technologies in the next panel. We will see how they can contribute to addressing these critical pain points. I was also thinking about an exchange that we usually have. You mentioned the capacity to process large volumes of information. So I was wondering what is the most important aspect in that kind of information systematization process that is not the datum per se? This is something that we work on together in a joint action with IEP. And you have all the theoretical background. So we have all of you very experienced also in the management field, but we have someone with us who has a broad experience in managing different policies. We have Sofia Leticia from Nuevo León. So what would you say? So let me give you some context about Nuevo León. This is a state in the north of Mexico with 6 million inhabitants, 1.6 million students, considering all the way from preschool education to the university, and all of them fall under the umbrella of the Secretariat of Education that I lead. So what are the key criteria? I have been in this managing position for 3 years. I still have 3 more years to go theoretically, but as usual, you never know if that is going to be the case. In Nuevo León, education is everyone's responsibility. So we work with private organizations, with civil society organizations, with universities for of the best universities in Mexico are located in Monterrey. So this gives us a lot of economic power. It is the number one state in terms of capital and production levels. There are three governance bodies that provide sustainability to the work we do in education. One is the Nuevo León Council that was created 10 years ago. It is a governor's council, but has different committees for every sector. And the president of the education committee is the vice president of the Monterrey University. The Nuevo León Council, together with us and with the governor and all the different secretariats with their respective committees, have put together a 2040 strategic plan. That is the vision we are after. There is also a trust fund that has been recently created that takes 1% of the payroll taxes for social projects. I have access to that. I put forward a project. If it gets accepted, I get funding. So now we have funds available from that trust fund. And then there is another one focused on new technologies, Nuevo León 4.0. So this means that we still have some obligations at the government level, but we hope to instill sustainability with this during this 6-year term. Uh, Another principle is that you can't improve what you don't measure. So we started with the right foot, with the support of international organizations, developing a test that has enabled me to know what strategies are being used to improve initial literacy or some essential learnings year after year. And this is information that is shared with the press, but also the schools receive their evaluation reports benchmarked against other schools and all the items in which they did well. You have a breakdown by sex, and then we have suggestions for next steps for improvement. So this has enabled us to improve our results in the last few years. And another important point is that although we are a federalist state, we place emphasis on federalism, and we have what we call the Nuevo León seal. So uh, what is produced at the national level is also given the Nuevo León seal because that is what our state needs. So looking at the pain points, well, I think that we need to be well aware of the situation in our territory. In this case, in Nuevo León, we have a very accurate social diagnosis. We conducted a study with Iglesias Foundation on social mobility to identify whether there was social mobility, why or why not. In Latin America, and Mexico is no exception, there has been not significant investment in education staff. So you cannot leave that aside because that is a permanent blow on the system. At a demographic level, although it is true that we are decreasing the number of girls and boys in school, we see 120,000 new families coming to Nueva León every year. We see migration increasing in Nuevo León. In the past, we didn't have um, our own population, and now we are the second state with a diverse indigenous population. So we need to reinforce inclusive education, and we also have to have a bilingual intercultural perspective, as is the case in other Central American countries. Then, what happened after the pandemic? When schools were still closed, we took office. So we are still mapping the levels of literacy in um, the primary levels and how the essential learnings can be improved. And then employability at the higher education level. We concentrate 66% of the nearshoring. So we conducted a gap analysis to see what we are teaching and what companies require from new employees. So we are we know that our students need to improve in technical English, the use of new technologies, and they also need to improve on the essential learnings, including communications, language, maths, and science. So, what are the scars? I think that any planner leading a secretariat has to look at the scars. Of course, we see the impact on education from the pandemic. We need to measure the impact and see how we can address that. We also have emotional and mental health. That is always an issue. We created a social emotional health institute, including also mental health issues. We also have the education pathways for the secondary school all the way to higher education, from starting with the ninth grade. And then we have the state-owned university. We are trying to find out how many children are born in Nueva León or arrive at the age of 43 days old in order to plan for higher education, in order to see how many stay. Because with migration, sometimes you have more children that come into the secondary school than those that finish the primary school. And what are the biggest challenges? I think that AI is at the top. AI, how can we teach teachers how to use AI? Because students already know that. We need to anticipate that. We need to learn how to use these tools. Other and teachers need to learn that. Then dual education in terms of electromobility, semiconductors, the 4.0 industry, the Internet of Things, robotics. So we cannot just be lagging behind what the labor market is asking for. So let me conclude with an experience from that we had in Boston. I was in Boston because there is a Latin American movement that is being developed at the Harvard Business School, Harvard Education School, sorry, to put heads, hearts, and hands. So if we want to have an initial literacy movement in Latin America, well, everybody mocked at us because we were there representing Nueva León, but there was a group that was represented by the mm, CEO of the trust fund, and that is a business person, representatives of the civil society, representatives of parents, myself, and representing the government. And that group was an interdisciplinary group that committed to generating that movement to get to 2030 with all children knowing how to read and write in Nueva León. So we do quantitative assessments also, and we measure that.
Thank you so much, Sofia Leticia. What you shared is very interesting. And in the second part, that will be a little shorter, I will go back to some ideas. The social reality is complex and uncertain. That is no news. It has always been like that. Actually, the history of humanity is built on crisis. Perhaps what has changed in recent times is that, as Alejandro mentioned, the recurrence and the frequency of those crises is higher, and the ability to react, although we should be able to be more proactive, puts up puts us in another imbalance. Now we are all imbalanced. Let's see how we go back from there. So when all these pain points are identified, the question is then, if everything is chaos and complexity, then why plan? It's a question that we receive recurrently at the IIEP. And from IIEP, we say that the more inequalities there are, the planning is more necessary, because if history continues as it has been right now, those inequalities will be deepened. And that is how the deliberate action of individuals becomes a tool for sovereignty. And perhaps what we should ask is not whether planning is necessary or not, but whether the tools we use for the planning are the ones that we used for this historical moment or not. And that has to do with how to prepare the budgets, how to think of information systems, at what point we decide whether we take the information systems, even if we don't have the perfect data for everything, but we cannot wait, because I have several more difficulties about education, but one of them is that as we continue waiting, there are generations of students. That is, while we are debating concepts, what each thing is, generations are left without improving their possibilities and exercising their rights to develop their life project. Of course, something that Maria Leticia mentioned that I think, Sofia Leticia, I'm sorry, is the importance of being context responsive. There are actions we know that work, and this is to answer what the secretary was mentioning in the morning. We know that there are generic things that work, and we know which don't. As Amatus was mentioned, I wanted to say that I've read him a lot through Ignacia Garrondo. We worked at the International Institute, and we say that planning is an art. It doesn't sound like good news, because we tend to think that you are born for art. But he says that, as in any art, you can train for it. But our institute can help support the development of those capabilities. And why do I mention this? Because crises are not only happening in the countries in the region. Today, we mentioned climate crisis, climate events, the recurrence of those events, migration, armed conflicts. And if you read the papers, you know that's happening all over the world. The difference, and that's what we work at the International Institute for Educational Planning, is that not all societies have the same level of vulnerability or being more positive. And connecting this to the study led by Cecilia, promoted by the KMM team at the IIEP, what are the capabilities to face that crisis? And their resources come to play. So what makes us different as countries in the region from other countries in the world is not that we suffer more crises, but that we have fewer elements to face those crises. And what we want to promote from the conceptual framework of the crisis-sensitive framework is to develop those capabilities to strengthen them, both institutionally and organizationally. And now, to conclude and move on to the second part, the only way, and Sofia Leticia mentioned this, is Understanding the specific contexts. What we know that doesn't work is to do the same in different contexts because the actors cannot own it. The contexts are different. As the Secretary Sponda mentioned today, we have countries that are bigger or smaller, but diversity is always there. And I also think that while thinking of standardized actions or global actions, we neglect perhaps the original knowledge that some populations have that for some reason, if you had visited an area that is prone to hurricanes or volcanoes, they even know when a crisis is coming, just observing the flight of the birds. So perhaps we need a bridge between the objective knowledge and the knowledge of those groups. But we're going to work on that tomorrow in a workshop after lunch. So let's move forward with the questions. I would just like to close this part. I think it's clear we don't believe in a planning that imposes an agenda, but that co-builds them with the countries. And I'm not saying this because I'm a rebel. Stefania Giannini has said this many times already in several events at the IIEP. But this is not possible without the engagement of international organizations. And that is only visible when it's reflected in funding, not just in discourses. And also without the real engagement of international organizations. And that is reflected in the availability of conceptual frameworks and tools to co-build with the countries. So what we propose from the area of planning in general at our office in our crisis sensitive planning is to support all countries, national and subnational governments in this process of strengthening capabilities so we are better positioned to face crisis. Now I'm going to read some questions. Thank you so much first for your time, so for respecting the times. I think I over. There's a question here. We received a streaming from Maria Lendim. How do we align planning strategies in the region considering the particularities of each country? Well, they are here, they've come here to listen to you, so I'm going to pass the floor to you. If you can answer in a couple of minutes from the area of funding, management, data, state capacities, I think it's an excellent question. Thank you. I think the key here, and I think it was mentioned in the morning sessions, is to plan and generate cross-cutting capabilities and capabilities to adjust. And I think in that sense, I do believe in planning, and I'm happy that IEP believes in this. And planning makes sense. And clearly, a planning that is adapted to the times, the populations, the territories. I think that's important. I would just like to mention one thing. Sometimes we all tend to fall into a common place of saying the world is increasingly faster and certain. And sometimes I like to say, well, let's calm down on that because it seems like we have to be running around and because the world is finishing tomorrow. But I come from a country that is prone to earthquakes. So whenever there's an earthquake, you have to stop and look. And that's what the IEP is doing, looking around, planning. Let's not just start running all over the place. And a book was published some time ago. Fernando Reimer, I, he's been to Harvard. Reimer's June, many of you have read that book. And there's a phrase that I loved that says, speaking of the famous competencies for the 21st century, it's like, but basically he says these competencies have always been there since Aristotle. The Greeks used to teach this critical thinking, communication. We can discuss about it. So these are competencies that have been there for thousands of years. The only difference, it sounds better if I say that Fernando Reimers says it, that it's the elite. In the past, it was competencies of the elite, but now everybody is supposed to have them. This may sound controversial, but this thing that the uncertainty and we're all dying tomorrow, well, we've been talking about the same things for 2000 years now. And as Alejandro was saying, we speak of AI, etc. But you go to any area in Latin America, and we are light years from that. And COVID has shown us that computers, internet, etc., in the long run was not okay. The dialogue, humanizing dialogue that permits reflection, critical judgment, etc. And we can plan for that. So I would just like to introduce a positive note here. Okay, we can plan because human beings sort of uh, 2000 years now are still the same in the essential aspects, the ability to think, our critical judgment. And what is the most important thing is the coexistence, the ability to have a dialogue and to co-build. We can plan for that. And that's where we are failing in something that has been there for thousands of years. We still haven't taught ourselves to be reflexive, metacognition, and all that. So I think it makes more sense than ever to plan because now we know how to do it and what things work. 20 years ago, we didn't have so much evidence about what worked in education, but now, thanks to the accumulated research, we sort of know what things tend to work in the long term. That's what I wanted to say. Very quickly, because I think we're running out of time, but I would put the emphasis on management in public policies. We have a whole framework in 8 public policies. Each policy can have different programs. If we try to see how we can create alliances with the other countries, I think it's through public policies, and then start to see within those public policies how many resources we have, not only budget, because we have great human resources, knowledge, that sometimes is not used. I think that is essential. And when we speak of information systems, I would say quantitative information systems, but also qualitative information systems, because that gives us another dimension. And I wouldn't like, first, I would like to thank again the IEP, UNESCO, OEI, ECLAC for the invitation, but also for looking at the situation at a subnational level. I think that the transition and the change has to start now increasingly more at a subnational level and not generalize it in national policies. And thank you for that. Yeah, more pressure, Alejandro, for being very brief. I think that the question was something like how we agreed regional strategies, yeah, considering the particular characteristics. I think it was clear, based on what we discussed, that planning, as in any educational policy, it's important to contextualize and not apply regional recipes. But most of us here that are working on cooperation, in the regional work, there's a lot. I mean, you learn from one another. That gives you a lot of benefits. And as I said before, new challenges, working together, it allows us to agree on how to deal with them, how to deal with these emerging issues, how to face them when in some countries they still have not developed that ability or they still haven't had those discussions. So that area of cooperation is the area where regionally it works. Another thing I think is important is when some agreements or consensus on educational goals or education priorities that are had regionally permeates in the policies and in the planning strategies of the countries. So the work that all international organizations are carrying out that today that are part of the current Agenda 2030, the Education 2030 agenda, gives us a framework for us to define a set of objectives that we agreed and each of us tries to move forward with in our countries. And just one more thing that Cecilia was mentioning, that very often the problem of planning is the lack of the theory of change. And as you mentioned, Mariana, those of us that have been in the public service, we see that the areas of planning, of budgeting, that in some cases are instrumental because they have to instrument the decisions made politically. Sometimes those decisions do not get there. They send you to do a costing analysis on objectives that have not been defined or a planning on priorities that have not been defined, and they end up being defined there. It ends up being a responsibility of the technical cadres that are facing that diffuse strategy from the top. So having clear objectives, clear priorities, that is the input that this exercise needs. And regional cooperation, I mean, the place where we all meet, countries, organizations, many times also helps define those objectives and establish those theories of change. So I think that's where the regional space is present. About this thing of how much is common and how much is specific, in the study that we are conducting, we start from the idea that there's increasingly more consensus as to the contents of the agendas. I mean, the research has moved forward, and we start identifying big keys as to what the priorities should be, even based on the starting points of the countries. But I think there is much less research about the how. I mean, what are the characteristics to be developed and how to develop them? And although planning is an art, following Matus, I think there's a know-how that the countries develop, and it's important not only to look at the countries in OECD, Finland, that at some point nobody could even hear about Finland as a role model. It was mentioned so much. And in the region, we have several cases of national and subnational states that have gone through improvement processes, and we can learn from them in order to make that experience more transmissible. And I think there we have to be very detailed. Otherwise, we just stay with the big headlines of what has to be done to plan as good as possible. And those mandates or those big headlines are quite overwhelming for the beginning administrations. But if we can look at the shades and understand how each country with their particularities develop those processes that are so difficult to scale, I think we could be improving a little more in all the region. Thank you so much. I think, well, we overstayed, but this is the kind of conversations that I think are substantial, where we can generate what you mentioned, spaces for learning. So thank you so much for your patience. And we continue. Thank you.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you, Mercedes. Okay, so we are in the final leg of today's program. I'm very honored to moderate the third panel of the 2024 edition of the Regional Forum. Here we are going to talk about planning for education in the 21st century, digital technologies, learning, and the world of work. So you are invited to actively engage with the Menti app. You have the QR codes here in the room, and you also have the link in the YouTube chat. But before starting with the remarks of the panelists, and while we get some survey results, let me review what we saw earlier in the previous panels and how they connect with uh, this panel. On regarding in the first panel, well, the first panel dealing with educational planning in Latin America and the Caribbean, we reflected on the meaning of planning, on the what, and the present and future of planning. There we mentioned the idea of a transformative planning exercise that has an impact on the work done in the classroom, as Daniela and Alejandra said. But we also came up with the idea of trying to protect policies so that they are not under the influence of the ups and downs of different administrations. Jose Weinstein mentioned that there are modernized dialogue instances now, as the other panelists were saying. In the second panel, we identify the pain points in educational planning. And here we looked at the necessary conditions for planning to be effective. Cecilia was telling us about the need to build capacity in the government, to have the necessary level of funding with this common north, how we can increase investment in education, as Javier said, and the use of evidence powered by technology. Alejandro was telling us about coming up with new scenarios for management, but also fixing the imbalances. And Mariana posed this big question: do we have the necessary tools for planning? So, in the third panel, we want to focus more on the how. How we can plan for education in light of current and future challenges. So we are going to look at concrete policy answers on the issue of integration of digital technologies, the improvement of learning and transformation in the world of work. And here we also try to move from analysis to concrete strategies with some policy examples. So to address all these issues, we have this excellent panel. Renato Perti, who is the president of the advisory board of the OEI, Guillermina Laguzzi, who is an expert on education and work from the OEI, Axel Rivas, the head of the School of Education of the San Andres University, and Mercedes Miguel, Minister of Education of the Autonomous City of Buenos Aires. Don't know whether the Menti is ready to see the results. Oh, this is great. I think that AI here has a big place, inclusion, equity, funding, competencies, inequalities, technology, equality, opportunities, justice, values. So I think that many of these topics are going to be discussed during this panel. So I have question for all of you across the board. What policies are you implementing to deal with the current and future challenges? Remember that we have a timer here. So Renato, I'll give the floor to you first. Let me begin by thanking Martin, Luli, the entire team, and all our friends from the OEI, the minister, other officials. Since we are going to address this from 4 different points of view, I will try to also to look at this issue from those 4 different viewpoints and also from the global level. We are now in a turning point for civilization. Our world, as it is unsustainable. The survival of our civilization is at risk. So rethinking education is not just rethinking a program, a curriculum, a pedagogy, or an education program, but actually rethinking education as part of this new model. If otherwise, are in trouble. And the core issue here is not technologies, but human intelligence. So we can power technologies as we power and leverage human intelligence. There is an ECLAC study on child poverty, and that is a time bomb from the point of view of human intelligence. So we need to invest on developing the human potential from early childhood so that we can later on leverage the use of technologies. My second point has to do with the fact that we live in a world where multilateral relations are very important. Sometimes we are worried because there may be an attack or some repudiation or some rejection of multilateralism. Without that, we cannot have education or an economy or society because society is the sum of many elements. So, education multilateralism is very important. 2030 education. We need to attach new importance to 2030 education because some people now seem to be against the 2030 education agenda. That is the transformation of individual ways. Then we have the transformation of education led by Guterres some years ago, who put forward some of the topics that are today at the discussion table: education for peace, sustainable development, and human rights. That was adopted by UNESCO last year. This is a statement in favor of a shared humankind and the Global Digital Compact and the resolution adopted by the United Nations a few days ago. We are no longer talking about education as an adult-centered system. We talk about education as a dialogue, discussion, solidarity, empathy, justice between generations. Our educational transformations have been uh, too centered on adults, and actually, these transformations have to be part of the construction process. And then we can look at the potential agendas on technologies in the field of education. I'm going to mention 9. First, policy on cultures, language policies, identity and native knowledge included in education, language, identities, knowledge. Then we have mainstreaming of technologies in education. It is not technology that determines what matters. It is the education that determines the technology. If we don't have clear educational proposals, then technology doesn't help us much. We have to be very careful with technological transformations as the magical one that is going to solve our problems. Then we have the access to uh, free of charge connectivity. Is that part of a global asset, a global good? The state plays a key role there to ensure connectivity, resources, platforms. It is the state that has that role, the state that gives guarantees, the guidance, planning, and strategy. The fourth element is the weakness of some education applications that are not necessarily aimed at educational goals. So we need to stop importing technologies into education. We need to generate a critical mass and have native technological processes in favor of learning. Then the fifth element, something that UNESCO has worked on, a framework of competencies, personal citizenship skills and competencies mediated by technology. The power or the potential of technologies to connect knowledge and to address the complexity of issues, trans disciplinary approaches. Technology can be a tool for personalizing education, but there is someone there who speaks about customization, the fact that individuals can be active in their educational customization. The use of technologies, and this is explained in UNESCO reports, to address the global and local challenges of sustainability, and technologies as a rationalization tool in public administration. For instance, the demographic bonus that Latin America has to expand the pedagogical borders, but unfortunately, as Estefania and Mariano Jaurero have said, education is no a priority in the public agenda. Just 2% of international cooperation funding is allocated to education. Today we talk about security and not education. Most of the countries do not give priority to education, and that is a mistake. That is undermining democracy, the possibilities for inclusion and coexistence. And I think that I'm out of time, but let me conclude by saying that there is a recent study by UNESCO. It's a framework of competencies for educators and students. This is a framework for working on competencies in relation to AI, the humanistic, the ethical dimension, the applications dimension, and the idea of co-creation, educators and students as co-creators. That framework was presented in last September this year, and it speaks about progression. Students understand, apply, and create. Teachers learn, leverage, and create. So I think that we are on the right path. I don't think there is a proper answer to technologies and the how if we are not aware of the fact that education needs a different level of reply given the significant issues that we are experiencing in the planet. Thank you, Renato, for this excellent first presentation. Thank you for bringing this up here. How technology per se does not solve the problems of education, teaching, or learning, but with careful thinking, they can be a means to do that. Once again, let me repeat the question for Guillermina. What are the educational policy responses that are being implemented to transform education in the light of current and future challenges? Guillermina, thank you, Fernando. Let me begin by thanking the organizers for the invitation to this forum and to take part in this panel. I'm going to give an answer to your question, or I will at least try to answer your question. But first, let me take these first few minutes to explain why it is important to think about education in coordination with work in this context. One of my potential replies would be that we need to coordinate, we need to link education and work better. That is one of the possible answers. Let me explain why I think this is important. Educating for employability has always been a goal, but however, education and work have always been competing for different different projects or different funding. We have different uh, formats that are more academic, and those formats that have more to do with labor issues for those who would not go to college. So we have a different social value and different audiences for both education and work. But linking education and work is important once again now in times of change. Now, there is a need to link the education system with the labor market as part of the social demand to education. We are going through times of transformation. I don't need to go into all those transformations. We know that the world of work is changing, employment is changing, identities are changing, technologies are changing, and education is also changing in the way teaching and learning take place. And education for work has proven to have the ability to address some common problems in the region. That is why we center our attention there. Of course, we need to renew the link between education and work, but education for work or for employment tries to address two problems: youth unemployment, that is a common problem in the region, and also the qualitative and quantitative gap between the profile of graduates from institutions, education institutions, and the profiles required by organizations in the labor market. So, why do we think that education for work can answer these, can have an answer to these challenges? Because of the link with the productive world, also because of the link with the curricular content, the ability to have short-term formats developed together with the productive sectors and that look for an answer to their needs in those economically growing sectors. And besides, education for work is seen also as a set of experiences of connection between the school and workplaces. This could be turned into policies. In vocational training, we can have some job placements, for instance, or internships, but there are some other vehicles that can boost that connection between schools and workplaces, understanding that there is an additional element. It is beneficial for students to have gone through this kind of experiences. So that brings something else to the table. So considering the ability to provide a quick answer, because this is part of its initial configuration when there is a close connection with the labor market and the productive sectors, we see that there is an advantage in one of these modalities, but we can also consider that the education system can liaise with the world of work in a different way. So, what are the trends, the policy trends that I can talk that are already under development and that have been supported by the OEI in the Department of Education and Work? We provide support to a number of projects at different levels. And there are three policy trends that apply to a number of projects that are under development. First, we have dual education or quality learning, ed receiving training or education at a school and at the workplace. This creates opportunities, and we see that students can smoothly go from school to the workplace. In different countries in the region, of course, we see different levels of development of dual education. In some cases, there are some consensus that are built. We are reviewing or using some existing agreements in Argentina. We are looking at that, but because this kind of dual education requires also a regulatory framework and some other elements. That is the first trend. So we are trying to implement dual education. Then we can improve the relationship of education institutions with the outside world. Some countries are creating offices to connect education and work, for instance, in the field of arts. And many people think that this is just for technical schools. No, that is also applicable to art school, for instance, in the Dominican Republic. So here you have a connection with a central policy level because there are different ways of establishing that connection. Otherwise, this will be subject to the relational capital of institutions. But we can also envisage middle tier of bodies, organizations that can make their own contributions and also connect these institutions with their surrounding environments. The third trend has to do with strengthening the teaching on general skills and competencies for employment as a um, cross-sectional strategy here. So I know that my time is up, but in closing, let me say that it is important to establish a connection between education and work. That doesn't mean that everything that is done in the technical schools has to be included into the system. Educating for work means educating for life, for the present life and also for the future. It's educating for the world, a world that doesn't limit youth opportunities, a world where they have to live. So this is what we think about this connection between education and work at the OEI. The world will continue to be uncertain, and we need to teach students how to learn to be in this world.
Thank you, Guillermina. That's so interesting to think about this connection with the outer world, how to deepen the teaching of the skills for work, and to go deeper into the complexity of this panel. We go back to the question, in this case, to Axel, about what responses of educational policies are being implemented to transform education in accordance to the current and future challenges, and with this perspective from learnings. Thank you. I'd like to thank IEP, OEI for allowing us to be here. It's a pleasure to be here in this forum after so long. And I wanted to start by looking, a couple of weeks ahead, there will be a very important meeting in Fortaleza in Brazil at the Global Education Meeting organized by UNESCO. And it's not just a coincidence it's held in Fortaleza. Fortaleza is the capital of Ceará, which is perhaps the most known case now of systemic improvements in education. And the Minister of Education of Brazil, Santana, was the governor of Ceará, so now he is at the Ministry of Education at a federal level because of what he did in one state. So trying to tell you briefly, I have a few minutes less than initially. I have to pay attention to the clock. So I will be very briefly describing you the history of Sierra, but breaking it down to try to analyze it. Apart from this project that I coordinated many years ago that had different layers, the keys to education, and today I have a perspective as to how the machinery works. So I will try to make a simple metaphor, a car. How does the car at Sierra work? There are four wheels. The first wheel is the word map that tries to summarize it. Sierra builds a map, a curricular map, a very clear map, very close to practices with a lot of knowledge about how teachers teach. It's not just theory, it's a clear map of standards, what students should learn in each grade to This allows teachers to locate themselves. It generates sequences between one year and the next. This translates into textbooks, materials, support guides for teachers. I mean, a map that has many branches, but is very coordinated, aligned with internal consistency, with a single sense. That map feeds from a second wheel that would be, in a way, supplementary that has to do with evaluation. Sierra develops different evaluation models. One is much closer to teaching, a formative assessment that is taken every 2 months by teachers with a support as to how to formulate the questions. Basically, initially very focused on literacy because the big challenge for Sierra is initial literacy. It's a program called PIKE, a literacy program at the proper age. And then other assessments that have to do more with an external view, one at the beginning and one at the end. They are nominal, that give outcomes per student, and this allows the schools to identify each situation. And this removes the ignorance as to who are those that are having difficulties, and it generates a commitment. Once you know the name of the student that has difficulties, it's more difficult to look in the other direction. So that is balanced in the front of the car, so to speak, with the support, with a strong territorial capacity to support teachers, not to leave them alone with their assessment to see how they work out the issues, but a lot of support, highly situated with an important team that supports and learns from bottom up, that generates an improvement process that is territorial. And the third wheel of the car, the back of the car, is motivation. And this word includes many aspects in the SERA process. One that has to be approached is incentives. SERA established incentives to the 150 schools with the better outcomes. They have an economic reward. The 150 with the worst outcomes receive support. And they generate a connection between the schools with the best and the worst outcomes. And if they manage to work together, that also generates a reward. And this reduces inequality because it improves those that were in the most unfavorable situation. It's like a virtuous cycle. But it's not just the economic incentive. There are other symbolic motivations, particularly in the case of Ceará, the ability to mobilize a project that is shared with a mission, an idea that the one that is in the classroom is in the same project than the person that is at the Ministry of Education. That is very difficult to achieve. And the fourth wheel of the car has to do with governance that supports the other three, but mainly the third one, which explains why an incentive system works. And that's with a lot of legitimacy from the government, with dialogue, trust building, articulation, time, that can generate incentives in a particular context. Perhaps that incentive in another context would not work, but that famous positive pressure works well. It doesn't generate resistance or a war of everybody against everybody. It doesn't stop the car. It makes it run better. That's because this generates a trust in the government mediated by the municipalities, because the state of Sierra has to work with the mediation of the municipalities. So these four wills allow us to understand a case, and that here I describe very briefly, but we can understand how the machinery works, that systemic achievement of the learning. Ceará is the state with the best results in all of Brazil, particularly in elementary education and particularly in literacy. I mean, it has managed to overcome the problem of literacy. Now all the territory is green because they achieved the literacy goals that Brazil defined. That machine, understood like that, allows us at least to establish a hypothesis. It's not the only machinery that is possible. Probably it has a lot of elements of the context that make it very difficult to move those wheels and particularly all the machinery to a different context. but I think it's an unavoidable reference to start the conversation. Now, that machinery, and with this I will finish, we also have to think what's the steering wheel? Where is that machinery going? It can go to different places. In the case of Ceará, it goes so clearly behind an objective that is shared, that is initial literacy, and an arguable goal that we don't discuss so much where the steering wheel is driving. But as soon as we start looking up, and particularly if we move on to secondary education, we need to be more clear about what direction we are taking. And perhaps it's not that way of driving that is more effective to achieve outcomes. But that steering wheel also, I think, should be discussed. Not only how we manage, because it would be an extraordinary achievement to improve our educational systems, but where they go, as Renato was saying. And there we have to work a lot more on comprehension-centered education. And there we have a bigger debt as to how to develop more complex teaching concepts so that the learning has value for the life of citizens and not just to repeat it in an exam. I don't know if that machinery would work for that, but at least we have a starting point to discuss. Thank you. Thank you, Axel. I love the metaphor that you're bringing of the machinery, the device, imagining this and also connecting this with what you described, this shared mission that I think it's something that has been cross-cutting in our forum this year. And to look at the management side, we have Mercedes here. She's in the everyday management, a challenge in management, and would also like to hear your opinion about these three topics we are discussing. Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation. I will try and tell you. I only have 5 minutes now. I was supposed to have 7. Okay, so I will try to reduce my speech in 2 minutes. But I've been at this management for 10 months now, and on December 12th, I called a large part of the Ministry of Education to work on what I thought was the foundational stone for this, and it's our 4-year strategic plan. It's called Buenos Aires Learns. It has achievement goals, indicators, targets. Each of the 12 public policies is evidence-based. We started with a very profound change. The team was very tired. I was very motivated because I had been out of the management for 4 years. It was very intense, but we worked tirelessly for 3 months based on a work made by a group that doesn't exist anymore, that is RACE, RESE. The question is very simple. Why? If we are investing what we invest, we have the tuition, we have the infrastructure, we have the educational systems in the world do not break the glass ceiling of learning. The document is very interesting. It's called Focus to Flourish. And that's what we learned to do, to put the focus. The ministry had a wide variety of programs, events, and things. We reduced all that to 3 specific axes. The first one is foundational learning, math, language, social emotional well-being as something that comes across all of us and is very relevant for the coming world. Today, first graders will graduate in 2036. We have no idea what they will find at the time, but we are certain about something, and that is that we are called to learn all the time. That's why the name of a strategic program, to focus on that. The second axis has to do with innovation in teaching and learning, something that Axel just mentioned. No doubt our biggest challenge is how we change the skin of that teacher that is teaching as he did in the past century for an audience that is completely different now, and for an added value of the teaching profession that has nothing to do with what it used to be, transmitting content. So that's a perfect storm that we are very passionate about. And the third one has to do with the digital innovation, removing the paper in the work, the full digitalization of the administrative part of the schools, and also the digital skills for teachers and students. The role of the teacher is very imbalanced with a big administrative burden, and we want them to deal with what they are supposed to deal with. So that is essential for us. Some important policies in a couple of minutes. One we are very proud of is what we are doing always based on Buenos Aires Learns. We changed the curricular design of a kindergarten for 4 and 5 years. We changed the curricular design of primary school, which has presented that. Um, we are purely now focused on language and the competencies of literacy and communication for all students, for them to be literate since first grade when they finish first grade, and to be prepared for the transition to secondary school, which is very demanding. And we made a big change, not just on what they have to learn, that the curricular change that we are sustaining in the city of Buenos Aires, but how those experiences of the student for the world of work, for the college world to be full and be able to choose in their lives. The world is now demanding a series of competencies and skills that are not just from now, they have been around for many years now, but the school didn't have any conversation with that preparation. And finally, because I imagine there will be questions, I don't know if we have the time, a policy that we're very proud of is schools in focus. 500 schools that we selected based on those that were more vulnerable in terms of learning and those that were the most vulnerable in social and economic terms. These schools have been supported since April in the territory with professional teams, with in management, language, mathematics. We did it nationally. It was called the Lighthouse Schools. It's a case study. We are proud of that. And we know that when we put the focus and the team and the resources and we support the schools, they all have the potential to improve. So that's what we are doing. We're working, following our strategic plan. The situation may lead you to many different places, but having a strategic plan that is evidence-based allows us and all the system that we remind them every month of our purpose, of our goal, and what wakes us up every morning so passionate about work, and this to make it possible for every child to flourish and to prosper with joy and happiness. I think the social emotional well-being is the matrix on which we have to work. So thank you.
I think that this management experience can also be of interest to other people following more or less the same paths, to give priority to projects and plans and with a focus on investment. I think that is highly valuable. Let me go back to this idea about transforming management, how we move from the analog school to the digital school from a management standpoint, from an administration standpoint. Many schools are still analog. They work with paper for the grades and for the reports. So that could also be a significant contribution to school management. So now we are going to have a few questions from the for the panel and from the panelists, not from the audience. So Axel can ask a question to Renato. Renato, are you ready? All right. I think this is a topic that we discussed on several occasions. This is linked to this current topic of new technologies. If you look back 15 or 20 years, we had some vision for the future from the point of view of technologies with Serval, the big example here in the region. What is it that you think in that regard today, now that you have so much experience? What is still possible? How has your mind changed about opportunities for technologies? That is a good question. I used to be an optimistic, but now I'm more cautious with the issue of technology. And I think that it is education that defines rather than technologies. I think that technologies can help drive change, but because education sets that. And then they can support learning and teaching processes. Before making a brief reference on Ceibal, I think that we need to move towards technology, considering everything, how to integrate the face-to-face and online formats for education. I think that technology can help us learn more in that regard, how we can move ahead with customization, the students' freedom to take ownership of the learning. Perhaps it can also help us find the tailor-made curriculum. And I think that technology gives an opportunity to consolidate the practice and the vision of a guarantor state. I think that is this is still the responsibility of the state in coordination with other stakeholders. It is the state, the government that needs to take that responsibility. With Ceibal, many changes happened. Everywhere in the world, people talk about Ceibal. I went to Africa recently and they were mentioning Ceibal. So let me speak about what changed and what did not change. Ceibal consolidated a long-term state policy. In 15 days, we will have elections in Uruguay, and nobody has doubts about the sustainability of Ceibal. Ceibal is part of the Uruguayan state. Also, Ceibal consolidated the social democratic state, and this gives opportunities, equal opportunities to everyone. It has production capacity, a critical mass, a local view, production capacity. It uses platforms as a common place for resources. So I think that Ceibal did not change the needle in terms of learning. It is Uruguay is a flat country in terms of learning. We haven't improved our learning levels in language, maths, or science. You were talking about what you do at the national level, but Uruguay is quite flat in that regard, and not because of social and economic reasons, because in the last 20 years we have decreased the levels of poverty. We are the country with the lowest levels of child and teenage poverty. We This has helped us through the pandemic, as proven by other organizations. And if you allow me for another 30 seconds, with Ceibal, we didn't have better educational performance. Ceibal was a creation of the Frente Amplio when they came to power. It was the first time that the left party came to power. So the Ceibal generation has already been assessed through the PISA evaluation. Ceibal also showed the big disencounter between the cultural and educational policies of bureaucracies and what you have in other sectors. The cultural clash. I think this is clearly seen in Uruguay. Pedagogy was not a core element in building Ceibal. In my opinion, and I have discussed this with Folga and other colleagues, with the excellent team, the pedagogical dimension was not given enough importance, and I think that that is a weakness in Ceibal. and it has to do with planning. What Martin and others were saying. Why? Because Ceibal was started without a powerful educational vision. The educational vision was quite weak, and there was no detailed change activity. So the region has a significant flaw on the pedagogical side. If you look at the development of expenditure in Latin America on education, it has increased. Countries have not reduced the budget for education. That happened only during the pandemic. But in times of prosperity, this is not politically correct, but I must say it, neither the leftists nor the rightists nor the center um, governments gave priority to pedagogy. Thank you. Well, this is a very interesting discussion now. Please don't leave the mic because now you need to ask your own question to Mercedes. I see that the organizers are looking at me. They are keeping the time. It would be great to have 5 more minutes. I think that they are negotiating, just looking at me and trying to negotiate with our eyes. What what curricular innovation experiences in the city of Buenos Aires for teachers with technologies have led to different technological introduction processes. And do you have any idea of whether they are changing or moving the needle for learning? This is great, but let me go back to the previous question. May I? I want to disagree with you on something. What you said is really interesting. I agree on that there was not enough focus on pedagogy, but if I go a step further, I think that we should have taken responsibility for using efficiently the education budget. I think because we are lacking implementation capacity there. Sometimes we look at what we want to implement and who we want to benefit, but the implementation strategy is where we get lost. It's not an issue of having more money or a focus on pedagogy. Well, perhaps to a certain extent it is, but I think there was an excess of pedagogical focus, but it didn't reach the classroom because there were no indicators, no objectives, no budget allocated to planning. So thank you for bringing that up here. We would have to hold an event just to talk about budgetary issues for education. So I'm sorry, I had to comment on that and I feel passionate about that. Now, going back to your question, I was a fan of Ceibal because in 2010, we designed the Sarmiento Plan, that is the comprehensive plan for digital literacy in the city of Buenos Aires. It has been sustained over the 17 years in power of the political party that has ruled since then, but it did not improve learning indicators. Ceibal was born just to develop the computing skills in young people. When we started measuring the impact of technology in the classroom, improving in reading and writing and maths, there was no direct correlation. But with the Sarmiento plan, we just plan for digital literacy. When combined with maths, the development of computational thinking and mathematical thinking are closely related. So now we can have that conversation between technology applied to the classroom so that it can improve learning. What happened when we started implementing the Ceibal plan? We came out of a curricular design based on the fact that teachers could not intervene until they reached the fourth grade. But since we started giving one laptop per child from the first grade, the kids would just see the whole alphabet on the keyboard. So they started learning the letters. So this is just a colorful note, but for teachers in the first grade, that was terrible because they wouldn't work at that concrete level. So today, this is taking place in the city of Buenos Aires. There is an evaluation on computational thinking. So in a few months' time, we will have the results. Samantha Bonelli is now being replaced by Jonathan because she is under maternity leave. So we'll share with you those results. Thank you. Thank you, Mercedes. So we are now in the final stretch of our meeting. So now Mercedes should ask a question to Guillermina. Do you have your question there? Yes. I would love to know, Guillermina. Actually, let me say that I enjoy listening to you. Which are the competencies or the knowledge that you think that we are responsible for putting in students' backpacks so that they can find a job when they graduate from school? Thank you for your question, Mercedes. I think that you need to focus on teaching general skills for work and competencies for work. So I think that it is also essential to insist on the fact that when we talk about general skills for work, we are also talking about basic skills, the essential knowledge, or fundamental knowledge, or essential learnings. We can't just focus on those general skills for work, like soft skills, social and emotional skills, if we don't also look at the general condition of the education of secondary school graduates. And there comes a problem because we have some general skills with some problems in sciences, communication, language, and maths. We also have some moral vacancy. Young people can't find a job, but companies also have a significant number of vacant positions. And when we ask them about those positions, they say that it's difficult for them to fill those positions because the students or the graduates lack the basic skills and also soft skills. Those that have to be included in the curriculum that were not in the curriculum in the past and are more sophisticated than just knowing how to obey or giving instructions. So if we think about those most basic skills, general knowledge, soft skills, and technical skills, we need to stress the importance of these aspects of education. And curricular designs take into account basic skills, also technical skills through the specializations, but there is a very little inclusion in design, especially when we see how that translates into teaching and ultimately in what they learn. We don't see soft skills and general skills that they need to continue learning, to continue studying, to participate in projects that can also have an impact on their lives because they have to make decisions, they have to grow and to continue receiving education. Now, your question for Axel. Now,
I have I want to ask lots of things, but you mentioned the metaphor of the car that puts this knowledge at the steering wheel, the core skills, the core learnings. What do you think are the areas of knowledge that should be prioritized in times of transformation in order to improve the possibilities of labor insertion of the youth? This question is related to another one. And what place do you assign to the skills in this construction? I have, I'm in a negative time, so it's very difficult to answer in such a short period of time. But first of all, short connection with what I said before, how important it is to start very early, since early childhood. A lot has been said about that. It's so important to generate better conditions in so unequal contexts. And since first grade, when each student will establish a relationship with knowledge, with their own achievements, to develop their self efficacy, that generates trust in oneself. So, in such unequal contexts, the future will depend on the whole trajectory. So, if you start on the margins already falling out, it will be very difficult to reconstruct that in high school. So, that famous saying of literacy at the proper age is very important, because that is where self esteem begins and the ability to learn. And then I don't have an answer for such a short time I have, but I would just like to say that it's not knowledge or competencies, clearly. We have to go out of that false debate. We have to start integrating in the disciplines like big filters of reality, how we see the world, and skills that allow us to interact with knowledge and make it worthwhile in life. Again, and to finish, well, we have some images, but we are short of time. So let's move on to the final part. I think this was a great panel to conclude this first day of discussions and debates around the forum. And it's been a pleasure to be with you as a moderator. So thank you. Good afternoon. I wish this were my home. If this were my home, probably I wouldn't be here. Thank you. Congratulations, IIEP. It's a great initiative, a great joint work with IIEP globally from the General Secretariat and locally with the representation in Argentina, and the work with UNESCO that is always so fluent and rich. Today, the Deputy Secretary General said, together we are more. It's not just the addition of individualities, but together we are more. So thank you all. Those of you that have come from abroad to join us, those who dedicated their time, Guillermina, let me tell you that she was a mother very recently, and this must be one of the first times she leaves her baby behind. This is the first time I see her in these 3 months of leave. I never called you and never bothered you during your maternity leave. So a big kiss to Julian from us. And two comments very briefly. One, going back to something that was mentioned at the beginning of this meeting. Remember that word cloud on planning, what's going to happen, the future, anticipation, and a series of words that had to do with that. I think it's important to remember, and several of the speakers mentioned this somehow or another, that we are in a process of change of a depth that has no precedent in the history of humankind. Not all of us, but in my case, because I see many younger people, but we are part of the last generation in human history that was born in an analogic world. It's difficult already to explain the way we lived when we were kids to the newer generations. That's not going to happen again. We are the last ones like that. So clearly, there's a difficulty in the planning process because the planning process is precisely the attempt of human beings to dominate the environment and anticipate uncertainty. That has always been the case. In the past, planning was not a science. It was rather an intuitive strategy because reality didn't change that much. You were born and you did almost the same as what your parents had done. Remember that definition by Rodolfo Busch about the Andean cultures. I see in front of me the backs of my parents working in the field. My future is my father working in the farm. That's my future. Today, the future is uncertain because the reality has become much more complex. That word was present in the opening. And complexity is not the same as complicated. Complicated is a watch, a clock that has many pieces, but they interact by default. Complex is random. It's absolutely random. I'm not going to go into the precise definitions, but what is random is uncertain. I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. I don't know for sure what the consequences will be of my decisions. That's why planning in the 21st century, perhaps by next year, Luli, we can think of planning for next month because everything changes and so rapidly that we are always delayed. As Ines mentioned today, the situational strategic planning, the rigid planning just no longer exists in this case. So what is uncertain and random and complex vis-a-vis some ideas that were present at some point, some said, well, planning is no longer necessary, but the outcome is the opposite. This demands better planning. This demands more data that will allow us to interpret reality because what is the data after all? If we discuss of governing with evidence, data is the construction of models to understand and interpret reality. So it allows us to make decisions. We need better, more data that will allow us to make better decisions. Today, planning is necessary more than ever. Better, but more than ever. That is what the context demands us today. And the second thing I wanted to mention to conclude, I would like to mention something that perhaps was not so present today directly. It was implicit, but not directly in this venue. And that has to do with the pandemic. It's over. We forgot about it. It didn't exist. But unfortunately, it did happen. And unfortunately, it left many shadows, long and dark shadows of suffering for many people. But as we usually believe at the OEI that we should also try and see the bright side of things, the pandemic has produced something extraordinary in education. And that was that for a while it dissolved, it modified, it flexibilized the standards and procedures that educational systems had absolutely rooted and that couldn't be changed. Hours of class, curriculum, content, how to teach the class, in-person classes, the standards were made more flexible. That was unthinkable before. No, you cannot touch the curriculum without asking. It had to be done because it, it was necessary to overcome the situation. And there we had a debt. We conducted a study by Lilian Toranzo. I don't know if she's still around. She was here this afternoon at the beginning of the activity, where we tried to rescue good practices at school level as to how they managed the pandemic, how they solved this fact that the children could learn in the different contexts and conditions and challenges presented by the pandemic. And I think that is where, from the perspective of a situated planning that solves specific problems, that is what the director, the general director of IEP was saying today, it solves concrete problems. There we have to make the effort, even if we don't like to remember the pandemic, we have to go back and see as directors how teachers solved real problems in an uncertain context and for which they had to plan. It was not an arbitrary decision. We used the family, WhatsApp, they all solved it as they could with that given strategy. So I would finish with this contribution to the general reflection. Thank you for joining us in this effort. Thank you, IEP, for trusting that we could be good partners. We hope we are. I think what Mercedes was saying today about making a specific reflection on educational budget, well, we should adopt it for our next year reflection. And let's think on this, planning for the 21st century or planning for the next semester, and then we see what happens. Thank you so much. Thank you, Luis. And now to finish the day, we invite Alejandra Cardini, the acting head of the Office of IIEP-UNESCO for Latin America and the Caribbean, to give a few closing remarks. Thank you so much. I will be very brief. First, thank you so much to all of you for joining us. I think it was very nice to get together again after 4 years of a virtual forum, not just those of us here having lunch together, but the 500 and something people that have been with us during the day in the different sessions. And I disagree with Liz because he doesn't know what's going to happen tomorrow. I do know. This is the end of the first day of the forum. Tomorrow we have 3 very interesting workshops on planning, one on digital technologies and planning, another one on planning that is crisis sensitive planning, as Mariana Cuse just mentioned, and the third, use of data for planning. They're exclusive for officials. That will be our core audience. So we'll expect you tomorrow. And I'd like to finish by thanking particularly the hosts, not just the hosts, OEI, ECLAC that has been with us, all the other officials and organizations that are here today, and a special round of applause for all the IEP team of Latin America and the Caribbean that have been working so hard. Thank you so much.